Christos Anesti. Amasikam. Christos Voskrese.
Christos Voskrese.
Christou Asore. So today, I grew up Episcopalian, and especially in the Episcopalian Anglican tradition, but in kind of Old English, this Sunday is called Low Sunday. And they're not really sure why it got that name in Old English, probably because the high Sunday of last week of Pascha, and then this is the kind of corresponding week that bookends the feast in a way, so high to low. But we always joke that it's Low Sunday, actually that gets that name because of the low attendance on Thomas Sunday. And I can see that we're following that venerable tradition here. But, the sad part is that when you miss a Sunday, you miss a lot, because if we see what happened in the gospel reading today, Thomas missed a Sunday. And kind of a lot happened that Sunday that he missed. The resurrection happened. And so when he comes on the 8th day, which means the 8th day, I think I explained this before, in the Jewish reckoning and in the Orthodox reckoning, the 8th day would actually be 7 days for us. It would be a full week. So in other words, it's saying on 1 week from the resurrection, it says in the gospel today, on the 8th day. So it's saying on Sunday, when the disciples were gathered together again. So this is where we are today. It's the next Sunday, the 8th day since the resurrection. This establishes the pattern for Christian worship, that it should be on the 8th day, every Sunday. And what happens? Christ again comes into their midst, which is what happens to us every Sunday. Christ comes into our midst on every 8th day after Pascha, every Sunday. And so when we miss church, we actually miss Christ coming into our midst in the form of the Eucharist that we're doing. Christ becomes bodily present here. But I want to talk to you today about Thomas, because this is more commonly known as Thomas Sunday. And we often hear him referred to as what? Doubting Thomas, the doubting Thomas, that he doesn't have full faith. He doesn't believe, and he's kind of portrayed in a negative light. But what I want to talk to you about today is last night in Vespers, there were two really fascinating phrases that kind of shape the Orthodox understanding of Thomas. And it's not as doubting Thomas. That's not how we understand him, actually. And that's why it's so important that these services of Vespers and Orthros, really in the inspired hymns from these services, they help as we're leading our way up to the liturgy, to the feast. These hymns help us shape how we're to view the feast that we're participating in, how we're to understand it. So what did it say last night? It said actually, O kali apistia. So, O good unbelief. O good unbelief of Thomas, which led the hearts of the faithful to knowledge. Good unbelief. And then in another hymn, it said, what a paradoxical miracle. Unbelief produced certain belief, or faith. It's the same word in Greek, pisti, faith or belief. So unbelief produced belief. And the good unbelief of Thomas led the hearts of the faithful to knowledge. So we don't actually consider him doubting Thomas. We consider him, I would think it would be better to say, searching Thomas or seeking Thomas. He has what we call this good unbelief. What does that mean? Well, we see in the Gospels elsewhere many times what we could call good unbelief. When Nathanael calls his friend Philip to come see the Messiah, and Philip asks out loud, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And of course the response, as almost always in John, is come and see, just like Thomas does. He has to actually see himself. We also have the case of the father who wanted Jesus to help him heal his son. And he says to Jesus, if you are able, help us. So this has doubt built into it, that Jesus really isn't able to help him, if you're able. But in both these cases, Jesus doesn't reject them because of their doubts. He doesn't reject their doubts. He sees this unbelief coming from a heart that is struggling to believe, a heart that is yearning, seeking to believe, struggling to believe. Because the same father of the little boy said, "I believe, Lord, help my unbelief." He's struggling. He's trying to come to believe. You know, this is so important. I remember in my youth, like I said, I grew up Episcopalian, and we went to church sometimes regularly, depending on if we liked the priest, and sometimes not so regularly if we didn't. Christmas and Easter for sure. And so I heard a lot about Christianity. I learned about Christianity, but I never felt its power. I never had that experience myself. I heard about Christianity from other people, but it never touched me personally. And this unbelief that crept into me led, unfortunately, to indifference, which it can. And this is what we would call bad unbelief. An unbelief that leads to a kind of indifference, or maybe just going through the motions, coming to church because that's what everybody does. But really no commitment, you know. So it wasn't until later, until I had become an atheist, actually. I mean, you can read the story, I think it's online. But I had become an atheist in college. And actually, it was because I had never struggled with this unbelief. And something happened to me that made it clear to me that there was a God. But I didn't know who he was. I didn't know how he could be approached. And so all of a sudden, I still had these doubts, but I started to struggle. I started to search. I wanted to have the experience for myself. I didn't want to just hear about it from other people. I wanted to experience. I wanted, like Thomas, to touch Christ. And this is how it can be a good unbelief. Because if this unbelief compels us to seek our own experience, to deepen our own encounter with Christ, then that's good unbelief. If here in the church, we have the tools to come closer to Christ, to deepen our relationship with him. We have fasting, we have confession, we have the prayer services, etc. These are tools that the church has refined over time that we know work to get us closer to Christ. If we use these tools, if we struggle with them, it's like going to the gym. The equipment is there for us to use. But if we just go stand next to it, that doesn't really do us much good. We have to use the equipment. And I felt like, anyway, growing up in the Episcopalian church, it never really gave me that equipment or showed me that you need to use this equipment to come closer to Christ. You have to struggle. And this good unbelief, I've heard it, but this is what Thomas says to us today. You're telling me that you have this experience, but I want to have this experience myself. I want to physically touch Christ. And Christ honors this. He honors this request. He comes and he shows himself to Thomas and he allows him to touch him. And what's the miraculous thing, the amazing thing about Christ's body in this gospel? It always fascinates me. So we have Christ is in his resurrected body. But what is it like? Because Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection. We are to come after him. Our bodies, our hope, our belief are going to be just like his resurrected body. But what is that? Well, we don't know. Obviously, it had some physical component. It's not just spiritual because Thomas is actually able to touch it. It's not a spiritual idea. It's physical. He can put his hand in Christ's wounds, which interestingly have not been healed. The wounds are still there. You can still see Christ's wounds, even in the resurrected body. So it has some physical dimension. Christ even eats with them after his resurrection to show that he is flesh and blood. He is not a ghost. But he's not exactly flesh and blood like our bodies. The fathers of our church tell us that our bodies have this kind of coarse materiality, but that the resurrected body is this fine, it's this spiritualized material. And that's why we read in the gospel today that Jesus can pass through the closed doors and enter into the room with them. So it's spiritual and material at the same time. Now the question is, if we're like Thomas, and here's the interesting thing, I'm not always recommending that we delve into this realm of unbelief and hope that it turns into a good unbelief for us to compel us to seek more. Because Christ says to Thomas, after Thomas touches him, then Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." He confesses him as mine, my personal, my Lord and my God. Now I've had that experience personally, and you are my Lord and my God. But Christ responds to him, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." So those of us who have not seen and yet believe, blessed are they, says Christ. But some of us, unfortunately, have a hard head, and we have to have that experience ourselves. And that's what I see happening among people of my generation. You know, the statistics are really alarming right now. The statistics are, in the recent survey, that they ask Americans to declare their religion, and about 23% say Catholic, about 23% say evangelical Protestant, and about 23% now, the highest of all time, say none of the above. They declare no religious affiliation. So what we're seeing over the since the 50s, this drastic change of people who have grown up in this particular religious affiliation, who are actively saying, "I do not belong to that group. I do not identify with that group." At least in the old days, people would identify with it even if they didn't go to church very often. Now they're just not identifying with religion at all. Why? Why are they so disenchanted? The statistics of our own Orthodox Church are equally frightening. 60% of our young adults, as soon as they leave the parish to go to college, never again set foot in the Orthodox Church. 60, when they go to college, never again come to the Orthodox Church. That's frightening. I think it's because this generation is this generation of Thomas. But that's not a bad thing, but we have to recognize that. They have an unbelief. It's no longer enough for them to hear about Christianity from their parents or their grandparents. Unfortunately, that's not enough for them. They want to have their own personal experience. But we have to show them there is a way. And where is that way? Where does Thomas come to the faith? He comes to it, like I said at the beginning, in the church. The setting is clear. Thomas sees Jesus. He encounters him. He touches him. Where? In the gathering of the disciples of Christ on the 8th day, on Sunday. That's where Christ becomes present among us. And how does he manifest himself? How can we touch him physically? In the Holy Communion. This is why we come to church on Sunday. Christ becomes present among us, and we too can touch him. But we have to do this with struggle. We have to do this with struggle to deepen our faith. And so that's what I think the message is for us today. We have to have a deeper experience of God. The church is calling us to this deeper experience like Thomas saw it. But it's not magic. It doesn't happen to us automatically. Yes, Christ reduces himself and comes to us in the Eucharist, and he so much wants to give us his grace that he puts it on a spoon and gives it to us to feed us. But for us, it's not magic. We have to come with some kind of struggle. We have to struggle with our faith like Thomas. We have to yearn to touch him, just like Thomas did. So now as we prepare to have Holy Communion, I urge you to deepen your relationship with Christ by really having that yearning to touch him, to know him personally, to touch and seek and draw from that power that comes from his material presence here among us in the Eucharist. Amen.